Okay. Hopefully I'm back now. Let's see. I'm just going to give it a minute here. I've got a little dashboard that tells me when everything is back online. Looks like Facebook is back online. Looks like YouTube is back online. Periscope is back online. Daily Motion is back online. Okay, LinkedIn looks like it's still reconnecting, so I'll catch up. So when we talk about using a Miller Trust to prevent the spend down or I don't use the word confiscation because Medicaid doesn't actually confiscate your money. They just don't give away any aid until you use up all of your money. The way it works. So you set up a Miller Trust, transfer the assets to that trust 60 months prior to the actual need for the usage of that. So, and again, you lose the control of that money. I don't know about you, but there's probably not many people in this world, including me, that I want to transfer my assets now with the potential that I might need it 5 years to have it protected 5 years from now, and I lose complete control of it. I never will do one. I'll never recommend one to I'm never going to recommend all of your control of your funds. Now, what about gifting to a child or giving it to somebody? Well, you can, but you have a 39 gift it to a child. However, there are big risks and problems with that. If you give money to a child, now that child is the owner of that money. If the child gets mad at you, they don't have to give it back to you. You can't imply that the child is going to use it for any of your care, because then it's not considered a true gift. You need to file a gift tax return and declare with the IRS and give that money to them. This is the way that the Medicaid system, whether that child, so that idea again is not back to my example of the husband and the wife. So the husband has 60,000, 30 social, 30 pension. The wife has 60,000, 30 social, 30 pension. And what you're doing is you're saying if the analysis is if the husband goes into a nursing home or needs in-home care, you're talking 80 grand a year, minimum. If there's 60 grand, where is the extra $20,000 going to come from? Well, if there is no cash in the bank, and they go as far as basically saying you can have a personal car, automobile. So sometimes what we recommend is before you apply for Medicaid, make sure you buy a car so you have transportation. So you can have an automobile. You can have up to $2,000 in net assets, including cash value of life insurance. And you can have a personal home. So now let's get into what happens. We're going to use the husband goes in the nursing home. There's 80 grand a year out the door. The spouse says, I don't have any assets. So Medicaid starts paying for the extra 20 grand. However, here's what ends up happening. Now the spouse doesn't have the kind of cash flow. She's got 50% of the cash flow that she was accustomed to. So when you see or hear, hey, the family home is protected, you got to remember that a family home is like a big money-eating machine. You have repairs, you have utilities, you have insurance, you have property taxes. The real question is, are you going to be able to afford those on that one person's salary? So now let's get into what I find is the most common issue. So we know that up until about the 1970s to 1980s, the majority of the people that went to a job was the male, while the female stayed home. Somewhere in the mid-80s to early 90s, that started to transition. Now it has transitioned in a big way. But what that means is that if you're in your 60s or in your 70s, most likely, I'm not saying this is the absolute fact, but most likely the male is holding on to 60 to 70% of the income between pensions and Social Security. Now, if you attended any of my Social Security classes, we know that if a spouse passes away, the surviving spouse gets the better of or the higher of whatever their Social Security was or the deceased spouse. However, here we're not talking about death. We're talking about a long-term chronic illness. So now if we have a spouse, let's change the tables now because I said there was a 50-50. Now if I have a spouse, a husband and a wife, 70% is on the male. So now out of, say, $100,000, I've got 70 grand in pension and Social Security that's allocated to the husband, 30,000 to the spouse, to the wife. If the husband goes into the nursing home care and the fee and the cost per year is 80 grand, the spouse might only be left with 30,000 because the 70 from the husband is going to be eaten up paying for that expense. So it's not as easy and as clean cut because not everybody has a 50-50 situation. So at least for probably the next 10 to 15 years, a majority of the people that are going to encounter this risk are going to be those families that have an uneven fixed income. Now, what if you're single? Well, if you're single, you have to make sure that you have sufficient assets to produce enough income to get into the facility that you want or to have the in-home care that you want. Now, also let me be clear. If you don't have enough assets to get into a pay-by-yourself facility, you're going to be relegated to a long-term care facility that's at Medicaid grade. And while I would love to say blame it on the government that they're this horrible institution and they put people into these rat-infested, roach-infested, Medicaid-only facilities, the bottom line is this. It's what did Kennedy say? Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. It's no different. It's not the government's responsibility. If we have the means and ability to take care of ourselves, let's figure that out right now. And I've met many, many people I've outlined this for, and they've said, I'll take the risk. I'll tell you one story about this. This is actually a really good example. So this is back when I was practicing in New York. And there is a place near Buffalo, New York, and it's, I'm trying to remember that. It's called I can't remember the name of the little town, but I was hired she was a nurse and he was a Vietnam veteran and he was fully disabled. Their mother, Gertrude, lived with them. Lockport, there it is. I knew it was going to come to me. It just took me a couple minutes for the old brain cells. You know, if you know me, I've taken a couple hockey pucks to the head. It takes a few seconds for the old brain cells to connect in. Lockport, New York. There we go. She was a nurse at Lockport Hospital, and he stayed at home. He was fully disabled as a Vietnam veteran. And his mom lived in the same house. Now, keep in mind, this is a 2-story house. And when they hired me as their financial planner, I said, well, you have a major risk here because right now your mother, Bill's mother, was paying for a majority of the mortgage because she lived in the same house on the second story or in the second story. I said, I really think you should talk to your mom about getting some long-term care coverage. He came back and he said, listen, my mom is a little spry and a little frisky about this, and maybe you should talk to her. So I never forget this. I'm talking to her, and she is just this grizzly farmer, she's tough. And she looked me right in the face. She said, I will never, ever go into a long-term care facility. I'll take myself out in the field and take myself out before I do that. And I said, Gertrude, my experience has been is that if something happens in a facility or the ability to take yourself out, most people are in this position sometimes. And she fought me on it. I told her that she should take some of her long-term care policy. So this is before hybrids. I'm talking probably 20 some years ago. And she said, listen, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the risk. I said, but you're not taking the risk. I said, my clients, your son and daughter-in-law, are taking the risk because if you get sick, you're going to lose the money because if they have to put you in a facility, then what's going to happen is your money that they're using to pay the mortgage here is going to dry up. She wouldn't go for it. Call about 6 months later. Apparently she was out gardening, had a debilitating stroke, completely disabled. And the unfortunate thing is Bill shot up in Vietnam. So he was not able to go up and down. Remember, Gertrude lived on the second story. So as they were explaining it to me, they said this. I said, well, what are you going to do? And they said, well, we can't put her into a long-term care facility because we'll lose the money to pay the mortgage. We won't have a house. So what are you going to do? I asked. Problem was, Bill can't floor. So they tried installing one of these little work. And so they had actually putting a hospital bed in her living room. And she was the stroke really gave. And so couldn't even afford to have anybody come in and care. So the wife, who was the nurse, had RN at Lockport. She said, well, I'm a nurse. I'll have to take care of her. Well, what ended up happening was get a call from Bill. You need to go home. She's going. The moral of this story is, and I see it over and over again, plan your journey, plan your pathway, but prepare for obstacles. They're going to happen. This is a part of life. We can't just ostrich us. Look at if you're in the sand, but if you're sitting on a railroad track and the train is coming, doesn't matter if you bury your train's still coming. And unfortunately today, now back then, it was different. Back then, 20 some years ago, the statistics were only about 3 out of 10 people would actually go into a nursing home. Today, it's about 7 out of 10. Now, that is a combination of either nursing home or in-home care. Now, you may have heard my beware of the annuities during coronavirus, and it is on YouTube and Vimeo and Facebook. Go back and watch that because this is where I talk about where these insurance agents are promoting the fact that don't worry about the principal balance going to zero as long as you get the income. Well, look, if you need to go into a pay on your own facility, a lot of these facilities are going to need a large lump sum to get in, which is why you don't want to diminish your capital. So now we get into the discussion of, okay, there's this risk here. How do we mitigate, reduce, offset the risk? Well, there's a couple ways to do it. And where I think the biggest risk is that have 10, 20, 30 million dollars. They've actually gone out and bought. Then tell me that long-term care the of the biggest risk is. The risk for healthcare catastrophe is not the single person that is only sitting on $50,000 to $100,000. Why? If you get sick, even though you might have a house, you may not be able to afford in-home care. So what you're going to do is you're going to go into a facility, and unfortunately, it probably will be a Medicaid grade facility, which isn't great. But the bottom line is if you don't have the kind of revenues or income to go buy insurance, and I'll cover for you in just a second what kinds of insurance, you don't want to diminish your other financial reserves by going out and buying too much insurance. So there's these three, I would say sections or categories is a better usage. The first category is you have to take the risk on because you don't have enough income to go buy the insurance and there's no other option. Then you have the second category. That's generally the middle class. You might be sitting on $250,000, you might be sitting on $1 million, $1.5 million. You have to look at that insurance as the way to protect or mitigate against a loss of the assets. If you're married, I would submit to you the risk is greater for the person at home, because if you lose some or all of your income to pay for the unhealthy spouse, you can't afford to keep the house. And remember what Medicaid does. They keep adding up what you owe, what they've paid in. And when you die, or when you liquidate the house, they can claim back. Every state has reclaim rules. They can take that money back. So you don't want to be in a position where you think the house is protected, but you can't afford to pay for the house. One of the spouses goes into a nursing home, virus, lung damage, brain damage, whatever it is. Now you've got to foot out $70,000 to $80,000 a year, and you think, okay, well, Medicaid's going to pay for that. No, they're not. They're going to pay for some of it as long as you have no assets. But even if you have no assets, they're going to put a claim on the house. So the middle class, to me, are the biggest at risk in this entire virus crisis that we're in of healthcare catastrophes, long-term care expenses, devastation of financial assets, etc. Now we get into the third category. These are the people that have sufficient assets and sufficient income to pay for the long-term care risk, whether you buy insurance or not. And again, if you're sitting on 5 million, 10 million, I'm going to tell you, it doesn't make sense. You can cover the 80 grand to 100 grand a year in your own assets from your own cash flow. So don't spend the money on insurance. How much insurance? It's got to be a calculation. That's what our financial planners are really good at doing. So if you want them to figure this out for you and show it to you, just call your financial planner. I mean, we're talking about our clients. We find that if you're with a bank or a brokerage company or what I call the fake financial advisors, these are the guys running around selling annuities or selling mutual funds, and they put financial planner on their business card, which is illegal, by the way, but it doesn't seem to be any repercussions. It would be like me putting MD on my business card. I'm not an MD. I'm not a doctor. And they'd put me in jail for that. It'd like me be putting a lawyer on my business card. I'm not a lawyer. So they'd put me in jail. But for some reason, the federal government is much more lax when people put financial planner on their business card, even though it's illegal, because they're not, because you have to have the right licensure to do that. But they don't seem to persecute or they don't seem to punish those people. So again, it's not necessarily the guy or lady that's selling mutual funds behind a bank counter. You got to have some pretty powerful software to figure out what kind of insurance, should you have it or shouldn't you have it. It's a very heavy calculation, because you could come in to our financial planners and you could be sitting on $1 million, $2 million. And you think you might need 80 grand a year in long-term care coverage. However, that might cost $5,000 to $6,000 to $7,000 per year. So when the financial planners are running these calculations, they might come back and they might say, this is too much of a drain by buying this insurance. They might recommend mitigating it and saying, look, I know that this is a big risk, but maybe we split it. We we only get half of the amount of insurance that you thought you needed to cover some of the risk, because we've got to mitigate it, because you can't go bankrupt by buying insurance. I always go back to that same old joke. Ask any insurance agent if you need insurance, and every one of them will tell you yes. If you ask them how much, they'll probably ask you how much can you afford, because that's how much insurance they think you need. Do I believe that this is a big risk? Yes. Do I believe that this is needed? Yes. But I don't believe that there's a blanket solution for every single person. And, here, let me go back to another issue. There's a lot of information online about how many years you should cover for a healthcare catastrophe. And here's what it says. It says that the average nursing home stay is 3.3 years. And if you've ever listened to me before, what have I always said? Question the studies. Who's producing them? How are they compiled and computed? What are the statisticals? What is the range that they're using? Like I've said before, if somebody comes out and says, well, I've had this performance, it's not in the stock market. Well, sure, if I picked a performance date on the lowest day of the market and I start that as my performance date, of course you're going to show amazing rates of returns. But that's not how you do it. You got to have a scientific way to do it. And why I'm telling you this is the 3.3 year in a nursing home is extremely flawed. It's a government statistic and it's flawed. Here's why. When you go into a nursing home, now 20 years ago, here's the example. 20 years ago, you go in a hospital. You go in for, I don't know, let's say a hip replacement. You stay out your 3 weeks, maybe your 2 weeks, whatever it is, in the hospital, right? They're going to watch you there. They got a recovery. They got PT there. They've got all those things in the hospital. Now the medical landscape has changed. Insurance has changed. Now the insurance doesn't want to cover you in the hospital. So what do you see now? A day later, they send you out. And a lot of times, where do they send you? A rehab facility. So you might spend 3 days to 5 days in a rehab facility. So now here's where the statistics come in. Federal government says 3.3 years, but you got to look at how they classify that. And a lot of long-term care facilities also have rehab facilities. So when they're producing 3.3 years, they're saying all of the people that stay in this rehab facility, the average is 3.3 years. Sure, if I've got somebody in a long-term care facility for 8 to 10 years, and then I bring somebody in for a hip replacement that's in for a week, it's going to skew the numbers. Give you an example. My grandfather and grandmother both died in their mid-90s. They were in a long-term care facility for over 12 years. 12 years. When they finally passed away, apparently I was named as a beneficiary. I got this nice little letter from their attorneys that said, sorry, there's a balance due on their estate. Why? The long-term care cost more than what they had in money. However, I didn't have to pay it. I wasn't in that time financially responsible for it. Which brings me to the next issue. And I'll go back to the insurance in just a minute. Is the Filius laws. And for some of you that have watched some of the stuff I've done, I talked about this case. You can Google this. Just Google 93-year-old grandmother causes debt to son. This happened in Pennsylvania. And here's the basis of the story. So the son, or the mother, I think she broke her hip or broke her leg or whatever happened. She went into a hospital. She ran up something like a $95,000 medical bill. And when she got out, she didn't have the money to pay it. So she left the country. She went back to family in Italy. So what the state of Pennsylvania did is they pulled what's called the Filius law. That's where they went after the son for the money. Now, many of you might say, well, that sounds a little ridiculous. Listen, there have been, back about 10 years ago when I first started talking about this, there was about 12 states that had the Filius law. Now there's over 32 states that have the Filius law. My worry is with this massive coronavirus, the debts that families are going to incur. Will the states that have this Filius law, will more states add on? Because 20 more added on in the last 10 years. Will the states that had the Filius laws start to enforce them and go after the family members that have the assets? Because if you're in a hospital for 3 weeks recovering from this virus, that could be $600,000, $800,000, $900,000. Are the insurance companies going to have a hard time with this? Look what happened to Hurricane Andrew. A lot of those insurance companies went out of business because there was just too many claims. If the insurance companies don't go out of business, how do the hospitals recover some of this money? Will there be a stimulus package? I don't know. My point is, you've got to make sure that you're prepared because of the environment that we're in. I've talked about this for years, but now is the time to figure this out. Now is the time to act. Now do this again. Now let's get into the insurance. So the insurance is a unique vehicle. There is long-term care insurance. Now, when I started 36 years ago, there was disability insurance, which would cover you while you were working. And then there was long-term care. And typically what I would recommend is you have a conversion policy. That when you stop working, they allow you to convert it from a disability policy into a long-term care policy without having to reprove insurability. As time went on and people started living longer, which meant that they might be in a nursing home much longer, the costs for long-term care skyrocketed to the point where most, and I don't have the recent statistics, but if I were to take a guess at it, probably 80% of all of the long-term care companies either got bought out, sold to somebody else, they stopped writing long-term care policies, or they went bankrupt. And the reason was the claims outweighed what they were charging in premiums. So now there's only a very few handful of companies that will actually write you a long-term care policy. It's also very, very hard to get it because any kind of chronic ailment, you could have RA, you could have, let's look at the virus, chronic lung problems. These are things that the insurance company says, how long is this person going to sit inside of a facility that we have to pay for, either in home or in a nursing home? So it's very hard to get, and it's very expensive. I would say if you ask me a guesstimate, and again, I don't know what these quotes are, but let's say you've got a husband and a wife and they're 65 years old. Let's assume they're the pillars of health. To cover what it would take to cover a nursing home, it would probably run $5,000 to $6,000 a year in premiums. It's a lot. And as a financial planner, we don't like that. Because anytime that we see an expense, our job is to improve the balance sheets, improve the cash flow. So if we see an expense that starts draining away with no potential rate of return in the future, we don't like that. So it's expensive. Now, about 7 or 8 years ago, insurance companies started seeing that the drop-off in people that were buying long-term care insurance, and the ones that continued to write it said, what are we going to do? Well, the biggest argument was, listen, if I go spend $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a year on long-term care insurance, what happens if I just up and die? What does my family get back? Have I spent $100,000 in premiums and my family gets back nothing at all? So they came out with what's called hybrid life insurance. Now, I want to make sure that you do not misunderstand this because so many people have come into our office and they've said, well, I saw Ken on whatever show and he talked about this and we have that coverage. And my financial planners come back and say another one misunderstands this. There are two kinds of benefits that you can include on a life insurance policy. These are generally misunderstood. One is called a terminal illness rider. That means you have to be terminally ill within a 1-year period of time, and the insurance company will allow you to use the death benefit for whatever you want. That is not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to the chronic illness waiver or rider. And typically, so don't, contain me and bottle me into, Ken said this is the way it works with every company. Every company has their own little spice that they add to this, but generally this is how it works. If I go buy a $100,000 life insurance policy with a long-term care rider, sometimes called chronic illness riders, typically what it will do is give me $2,000 per month, 2% of the death benefit. Again, this is generally, until the policy usually either goes up to about 95 to 98% until they pay that much out. Now, there are some companies out there that will say, hey, if you pay me an extra fee, we'll add on a lifetime rider. And that says, hey, what happens if I have a $100,000 policy? They pay me 2% per month, which is $24,000 in a year. In about 4 years, my death benefit's going to be all used up. And then my long-term care stops. In my history, the people that we've seen go into long-term care facilities, that number is closer to 6 to 8 years, not 3.3. So what happens if my death benefit runs out? Well, some companies will say, listen, for an extra fee, then you can add on this lifetime income rider. That will allow you to continue that 24 hours away before you've used up your death benefit. Now, if you ask me, why do I like this idea? I'm going to die. Sooner or later, I'm going to die. We're going to die. And which means that if I give some insurance company anything, because quite frankly, I have no great love for a bank, a brokerage company, or an insurance company. Probably my least favorite right now are the banks. These dirty rats, they're really holding America hostage with this PPP program, but that's a whole nother webinar. But if you're going to give an insurance company money, you want to see something returned. I mean, we have homeowners insurance. You pay for it for years. If you never have a claim, you never get any money back. And the minute you get a claim, they increase your rates or they don't give it to you anymore. Same thing with car insurance. Long-term care insurance is the same way. If I have a long-term care policy, I pay $5,000 a year for 10 years. I spent out $50,000. If I just up and die, insurance company keeps that $50,000. However, if I have a hybrid policy, I have a $100,000 death benefit. Let's say I pay the same $5,000 a year for it. If I go into a nursing home and they pay out $24,000 a year for 4 years, my family got my money back. If I up and die, they pay out the $100,000. My family gets my money back. So for me as a financial planner, I see much greater value in using that type of protection. So before we conclude, again, let me just give you what I think the next action steps are. Number one, calculate, calculate, calculate. Don't just go out and buy insurance. Don't be sold into it. Don't be feared into it. You got to do the calculations. How do you do that? Call your financial planner. Have them run the scenarios. Have them run the calculations. Now, if your financial planner is one of those fake financial planners, call our office. Mandy or Amma will line you up with one of the financial planners, and they can talk to you about how they can run that analysis. If you're a client of our firms, reach out to your financial planner if you want them to do this. They can run that calculation for you. And then they can come up with some alternatives as to what the ways are that you can protect it. They might come back to you and say, you don't need it. You don't now, nor will you ever need it. They might come back, it's not worth it. They might come back to you and say, well, here's the program, but we recommend you this much. So again, it's based on relations. With that in mind, let me just please state again, is enemy we could ever have. It's just a horrible thing what's happening to humanity. I saw today, 30,000 people had passed away. That's just, that's 10 times what happened in 9/11. 57,000 fighting Vietnam. And within about 2 months, we're like 70% of all those men that lost their lives in Vietnam. This is a horrible thing. So please, please stay safe. And you know what that means. Wear masks, all the stuff that the people are telling you to do. But second, please prepare yourself financially. Make sure that you have the right healthcare power of attorney, the right digital access, the right location, the right people in the right location. Number two, make sure that you've got financial protection against an in-home or nursing care financial or healthcare catastrophe, because this virus could tear us up. It could cause lung problems, health problems, all chronic long-term care issues. So please make sure that these things are covered. I have it. I have disability insurance. What I've done is I've split it up between two different companies. Why? Diversify, just like you diversify with investments. You don't know that one insurance company won't go out of business. Same thing. I have disability insurance, and I also have the hybrid insurance, and I've done the same thing. I've split it up between multiple companies because, again, diversify, diversify, diversify. With that in mind, I'll see you next time.